Sometime just before 5 in the morning, a man walked barefoot down a Halifax street pushing a green compost bin. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't hiding. He walked 3 blocks, Agricola to North Street, in the dark, in his bare feet, and then he walked back. What was in the bin, the police would later establish beyond any doubt, was a 36-year-old police officer named Catherine Campbell. The man pushing it was someone she'd met 4 hours earlier. She had been dancing with him. She had just moved. That's the detail that stays with you. June 2015. Catherine Campbell packed up and relocated to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, started commuting across the harbor to her job with the Truro Police Service, and began the quiet, unglamorous work of building a life somewhere new. New apartment, new routines, 2 cats. The kind of life that exists mostly in small decisions. Which coffee shop, which route to work, which bar to go to on a Thursday night when the week has been hard and you just need to be somewhere that isn't home. She had been a cop for 6 years. Before that, and alongside that, she was a volunteer firefighter, a decade of it. A retired Truro officer who worked with her described her as someone who knew exactly when to be caring and exactly when to be the harder thing, the person who holds the line. Her Aunt Mandy Wong said she was brave, beautiful, strong, and that once Catherine set a goal, she didn't stop until she'd reached it. These are the kinds of things people say at funerals, except the people who said them about Catherine said them in courtrooms and to journalists and on the record, and they said them like they meant every word. The week ending September 10th, 2015 had been difficult. She told people that. So on Thursday night, she called a cab from her apartment on Windmill Road and went downtown to the Ale House on Argyle Street. It was just a bar. It was just a night out. She danced. She met someone. His name was Christopher Garnier. He was 28 years old, and he used to work at the Ale House, which is why he was comfortable there, why he knew the layout, why he knew how to make the night feel easy. He had also trained as a paramedic. That fact will matter later. Surveillance cameras inside the bar caught what happened between them. Her leg around his waist, her arms around his shoulders. They stayed until almost 3:40 in the morning. Then they left together, caught a cab, and arrived at a house on Macaulay Street that belonged to a friend of Garnier's. That friend was, at that exact moment, in the Halifax police drunk tank. The house was empty. Catherine's alarm was still set for the next morning. Her cats had food in their bowls. She was planning to come home. On September 14th, Catherine didn't come to work. 4 days after she'd left for a night out, she hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't told anyone where she was. Her colleagues in Truro raised the alarm. Halifax police attended her apartment on Windmill Road and found the television on, the alarm clock ringing into an empty room, and 2 cats circling bowls that had been dry for days. No sign of a struggle. No note. No explanation. Just a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. What police didn't know yet, what no one outside that Macaulay Street house knew, was what Garnier had done in the 5 days between Catherine's death and the moment her colleagues raised the alarm. On Saturday, September 12th, 1 day after the murder, he reconciled with his girlfriend, Brittany Francis. He moved back in with her. On Sunday, he attended his father's birthday party. He smiled. He laughed. Everyone who saw him that weekend said he seemed entirely himself. He was also, during that same period, driving around Halifax with a tarp, a blanket, and a 5-liter gas can sitting in his car. Police pulled the surveillance footage from the Ale House. It was clear. The cab driver who'd taken the couple to Macaulay Street remembered them without difficulty. The cameras outside the Macaulay Street property showed a parking lot, a rear entrance, and, at just before 5 in the morning on September 11th, a figure dragging a large green compost bin toward the street. The same figure, a short time later, dragging it back in the opposite direction. Barefoot, unhurried, taking his time. On September 15th, police brought Christopher Garnier in for an initial interview. He told them yes, he'd spoken to Catherine at the Ale House. He denied going home with her. They already had the footage. The next day, police found Catherine's body. She was down an embankment near the Barrington Street on-ramp to the McDonald Bridge, covered by an ottoman. A green compost bin was found approximately 500 meters away. Catherine's keys were found in a garbage bin near the body. Garnier was arrested that same day, not at home, but in his car. When police searched the vehicle, they found a tarp, rope, a blanket, the half-full gas can, a backpack with changes of clothes, his passport, and his medication. He had been driving toward the bridge when they pulled him over. The car told its own story before he said a single word. He was taken to the RCMP detachment in Lower Sackville and placed in an interview room with Corporal Jody Allison. What followed was 9.5 hours of videotaped interrogation. By the end of it, Garnier had confessed. He told investigators he had punched Catherine in the face and strangled her with his hands. He said he could hear her last gasp. During that interrogation, police also obtained a warrant for the McCulley Street apartment. There, they found Catherine's blood on the den floor, on the back of the television, on the cupboard handle where cleaning supplies were kept. Every sample matched. The apartment's computer also had a search history: memory loss from alcohol, memory loss from antidepressants. Garnier had been researching, in the days after the killing, whether he could claim he didn't remember. The trial opened in November 2017 at Nova Scotia Supreme Court in Halifax before Justice Josh Arnold. The Crown was led by Christine Driscoll. The defense retained Joel Pink, one of the most prominent and experienced criminal defense lawyers in Canada, a man who had spent decades in courtrooms exactly like this one, and who had a theory. The Crown's case was built on things you could see: the alehouse surveillance footage, the parking lot footage, the image of a man barefoot at 5 a.m. with a bin. DNA evidence placed Catherine's blood on the stereo, the television, the cupboard, and the floor of the McCulley Street apartment. A T-shirt found in a nearby dumpster carried her blood. And, the most specific piece of physical evidence, the nail clippings taken from Catherine's hands during her autopsy contained both her blood and Christopher Garnier's DNA, transferred, the expert testified, most likely through the friction of scratching. The Crown also returned to the car: a tarp, a gas can, a passport, the computer searches for ways to explain away a memory. The jury was being shown not just what Garnier did on the night of September 11th, but what he did in the days that followed, the calculation of a man trying to stay ahead of what he'd done. Dr. Matthew Bowes, Nova Scotia's chief medical examiner, took the stand and explained what manual strangulation actually looks like from the inside. Catherine's cartilage was broken, her nose was broken, and the process of dying that way, he told the jury, takes between 2 and 6 minutes. Not a moment, not a flash of something uncontrolled. 2 to 6 minutes is a decision sustained. Joel Pink's defense was that Catherine Campbell had asked for it. His argument, delivered in court, on the record, in front of her family, was that her death was an unfortunate accident during consensual rough sex, that she had initiated it, that she had asked to be choked, and that Garnier had stepped away to fetch a towel and returned to find her unresponsive. Garnier put himself on the stand and said that when he came back, her eyes opened. He heard air come out of her lungs. He said his vision blurred. He did not call 911. He did not attempt CPR. He had been trained as a paramedic. He knew what CPR was. He knew what a pulse was. He knew exactly what no pulse meant. He chose not to call. He put her in a bin and walked her to a bridge. The defense called one witness to support the claim that Catherine had such inclinations. The witness's name is under a permanent publication ban, and it will stay that way in this script. He testified that on one occasion, Catherine had placed his hand on her throat during sex. Under cross-examination by Christine Driscoll, he confirmed he had applied no pressure. He confirmed it was, in his words, a caressing fashion. He confirmed she had never asked to be choked, never asked to be dominated, never asked for anything resembling what Garnier was describing. Then came the moment the whole defense collapsed under its own weight. During that 9.5-hour interrogation, the one Garnier had sat through 16 months earlier, in a gray padded room with photographs spread in front of him, police had asked him directly whether Catherine had wanted to be choked. He had shaken his head. No. He had not mentioned a request for rough sex. He had not mentioned consent. He had not told that story to the people in that room, even when it would have been the most useful thing he could possibly say. What you just saw was recorded in September 2015. It was played in full to the jury in November 2017. It was, in the end, the most honest thing Christopher Garnier said in any room during this entire case. Not because it was a confession, but because of what it wasn't. It wasn't a man telling the story he would later tell from the witness stand. It wasn't a man describing an accident or a misunderstanding or something she had asked for. It was a man who had just done something and who sat in a room with the evidence in front of him and who shook his head. During the trial, a police officer read aloud a letter Garnier had written to Catherine's family. He said he'd always been a caring person, that this was his darkest moment, that if he could give his own life to get hers back, he would. The letter existed. The jury heard it. They deliberated for less than 5 hours. Justice Josh Arnold, in his written sentencing decision, described what the jury had determined in language that left no room for interpretation. Catherine Campbell, he wrote, was expecting romance and affection on the evening she was murdered. She was vulnerable. For reasons that remain officially unknown, and that word unknown matters, Garnier punched her in the face, broke her nose, strangled her to death, and then treated her remains like garbage. On December 21, 2017, they returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of performing an indignity to human remains. What you hear in her voice is not relief. It is exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for 2.5 years and has just been told they can set it down. And who knows, somewhere underneath the composure, that they will never fully set it down. She was glad it was over. She said so. And that sentence, glad it's over, from a mother talking about her daughter's murder trial, is one of the saddest things in this entire case. There was still a sentencing hearing to come, 8 months away in August 2018. The family had to go back. Susan Campbell stood in that courtroom and delivered a victim impact statement. She said, "A part of me died the day my daughter died." She said, "There will be no forgiveness." Catherine's sister, Amy Garneau, told the court that her 5-year-old daughter had become afraid to go outside, convinced that the bad man who hurt Aunt Catherine would come for her, too. She also told the court that her daughter wanted to be a police officer, just like Catherine. Garnier stood and apologized. He said he knew there was nothing he could do to ease their pain. Justice Arnold sentenced him to life in prison. In Canada, second-degree murder carries a mandatory life sentence. The question a judge decides is how long before the convicted person can apply for parole, and that range runs from 10 to 25 years. Arnold set Garnier's parole ineligibility at 13.5 years. He also imposed a concurrent 4-year sentence for the indignity to human remains charge. The math means Christopher Garnier cannot apply for parole until 2030. The case was closed. The sentence was handed down. It should have been the end. It wasn't. At the sentencing hearing, before Arnold imposed the sentence, Joel Pink made one final argument on his client's behalf. An expert witness had testified that Garnier had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder caused directly and specifically by the act of killing Catherine. Pink argued this suffering should be considered a mitigating factor in determining how long Garnier would wait before seeing a parole board. The Crown's response was a single word: perverse. Arnold did not accept the argument as a mitigating factor, and the 13-and-a-half-year ineligibility period stood. But the PTSD claim didn't disappear with the sentencing. It went somewhere else entirely, because what emerged in the coverage of the hearing was a secondary fact that nobody had expected. Veterans Affairs Canada had been paying for Christopher Garnier's therapy. Here's how that was possible, because it requires an explanation. Garnier himself was never in the military. He has no service record. But his father, Vince Garnier, is a veteran, and Vince Garnier has his own PTSD diagnosis from his own service. Under Veterans Affairs Canada's family benefits policy at the time, the cost of mental health treatment for a veteran's immediate family members was covered, including adult children, including, as it turned out, an adult child who was incarcerated for murder. The private psychologist treating Christopher Garnier had been funded, through that family benefits provision, by the federal government. Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil described himself as stunned and shocked. He raised the matter personally with Veterans Affairs Minister Seamus O'Regan. The story moved from the court's pages to the front pages and then to Parliament Hill, where the Conservative opposition introduced a motion specifically calling on the government to revoke Garnier's benefits. The vote came to a deal. It was defeated, 151 to 127. That vote needs a moment of explanation, because the number is going to bother you. The defeat was not a statement that 151 members of Parliament thought Christopher Garnier deserved taxpayer-funded therapy. It was a party-line vote in a Parliament where the governing Liberals held the majority and where ministers had already announced a policy change going forward, meaning the government's position was that the system would be fixed, not that the specific beneficiaries should be targeted by legislation. Whether that reasoning satisfies you is your call. What Minister O'Regan announced was this: going forward, incarcerated family members of veterans would not receive VA benefits. The loophole would be closed. What he did not announce, and what the department has never confirmed, citing privacy, is whether Christopher Garnier's own benefits were revoked as a result. That question has never been answered publicly. As of the research underpinning the script, it remains open. That unresolved question was not the only one Garnier was still fighting. He appealed his conviction. The grounds were threefold: that the police interrogation tactics used in that 9.5-hour session had elicited a false confession, that his rights under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Freedoms had been violated, and that Justice Arnold's instructions to the jury had been overly complex. The Nova Scotia Court of Appeals considered all three grounds. In July 2020, they dismissed the conviction appeal in full. The only adjustment was a minor correction to how certain pretrial custody days had been calculated. The conviction stands. The only thing that does not stand, the only thing that has never been resolved, and that Justice Arnold himself acknowledged in his written decision, is the question of why. Why Christopher Garnier attacked Catherine Campbell that night has never been established. There was no argument visible on the surveillance footage, no established prior relationship, no confirmed motive. He said he didn't know how it happened. He said he had been trying to remember. The court made its decision about which version to believe, and the decision was unanimous, and it took less than 5 hours. What is not in dispute is who Catherine Campbell was. She was a cop who spent a decade running into burning buildings on her days off. She was the kind of officer her colleagues described in specific terms, not just good at the job, but precise about it, careful about when to be soft and when to be firm, the kind of person a department notices. She had just moved somewhere new, was in the middle of building something, was 36 years old with a whole second half of a life that was supposed to happen. Her niece, 5-year-old, afraid of the dark for a while after all of this, still wanted to grow up to be a police officer, just like her. Catherine Campbell is buried in Pictou County. She was 36 years old. The man who killed her will be eligible to ask a parole board for release in 2030. That's the case. That's who she was.